Hello, I'm John Cook from Asbury Seminary, and I've been asked the question, how exactly do the Psalms point to Christ, especially in the context of the book of Acts? Well, on a general level, we could say the Psalms point to Christ in as much as the New Testament writers are overarchingly concerned with who Jesus is, the person and work of Christ. And in the preaching in Acts, this is the case as well. And the Psalms is actually the most often quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. And so, of course, the New Testament is full of quotes from Psalms on this general concern with Christ. But if we look a little further, we can see there's three basic ways in which the Psalms point to Christ. And these are all evident in the preaching in the book of Acts. The first way is that most of the Jews and Christians of the early church period believed that the book of Psalms was essentially prophetic. That is, David and the writers of the poetry of Psalms were not simply writing about their own circumstances, but about circumstances that reached beyond them. When Jesus approaches the religious authorities in Mark 12 and asks them the question about who's David talking about in Psalm 110 when he says, "My Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand," they're assuming that David must be talking about something beyond just his own experience. And so we see that assumption at work. In Peter's sermon in Acts 2, he points out this prophetic aspect in a very typical way of early church apologetics. He basically draws on Psalm 16 and says, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades," and essentially reasons that David died. So if David died, how could this possibly have been referring to David's own experience? He must actually have been prophetically referring to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the preaching of the early church essentially saw the Psalms as prophetic and saw them being fulfilled then in the person and work of Jesus Christ. A second way in which the Psalms point to Christ is a more specific sense in which Jesus, of course, is seen as the fulfillment of the aspirations of the Davidic monarchy. The Psalms are, by some scholars, viewed as essentially a cantata, a long and drawn-out story and song about the whole Davidic monarchy. And so, wedded and woven throughout the Psalms, we have references to David, to David's line, to the position of the Davidic king. And so the New Testament writers look back on that and draw on that to explain the significance of who Jesus is as essentially the son of David who comes to receive the kingdom from David. So an example is Psalm 2, which is a royal psalm. It talks throughout it, the psalm, about who the who the Davidic king is with respect to God. And it talks about it in terms of sonship, that the Davidic monarch is adopted by God, is the son of God. When we get to the New Testament, then, Paul in Acts 13 preaches the good news about Jesus Christ by saying, who is he except the Son of God that's referred to in Psalm 2, meaning that he is the full realization of what it means for a royal Davidic Messiah to be in this special relationship with the Father as his son. In Acts 4, Peter and John draw on the first part of that same psalm, Psalm 2, that talks about the nations rising up against the Lord and against his anointed one, meaning his Christ. And they explain that this refers prophetically to the opposition that the early church is experiencing at the hands of the religious authorities and the nations around them. So these references to David and to David's descendants are seen as ultimately fulfilled in Christ. A third way in which the Psalms refer to or point to Christ is in their general eschatological tenor. Eschatology simply means a transition from one time to the next, and a majority of the Psalms, the psalmists are saying to God, save us. Psalm 28 ends with, "Oh, save your people and bless your inheritance." And the New Testament, of course, confesses that these realizations of God's saving work to bring us into a new time are most realized in Jesus Christ himself. And so throughout the Psalms, where the psalmists are longing for a new act of God to intervene in history and to save them in that circumstance, the New Testament preachers in Acts are saying this is fulfilled by none other than Jesus Christ in his person and work. And so in those three different ways, in terms of general messianic hope, a prophetic statement about who the Davidic monarch would be, and then generally this eschatological hope for God stepping into history and saving those who call upon him. All of these are ways in which the Psalms point us in the direction of Christ. Thank you.